Welcome to another edition of Cinematic Happy Comfort Food, where I invite a special guest to talk, or maybe perhaps even gush, about a very special film of their choice. Not necessarily their favourite film, but the one that they always pull off the DVD or Blu-ray shelf when they need the satisfaction that only that particular film gives them. Yeah, you could get something healthy out of the fridge, but fuck it, I've had a rough day, I want some ice cream. What's your cinematic equivalent of that? Well, I think we've got a really good candidate right here. So without further ado, please let me introduce a man who has been with the Movie Moan podcast almost since it began several years ago. A man who's introduced me to many excellent films over the years and always has excellent taste. Mr., or should I say, Captain Ed Hocken, what film have you chosen for us tonight?
Well, Phil, I chose the 1997 film L.A Confidential.
Great choice. Fantastic choice. The moment you said it to me, I said, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to watch it right now. And I did. The moment you said it, I said, I'm going to watch that right now. So, why do we pull L.A Confidential off the shelf? What is it about this film?
Well, I gave this whole question about cinematic comfort food a lot of thought. And what made me go back to L.A Confidential was that about a month prior, James Ellroy came out with a book that's kind of a prequel to L.A Confidential called Perfidia. And it's set in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor, and there's Dudley Smith, and then there's Buzz Meeks, and there's a bunch of characters that are referenced in L.A Confidential show up in this book. And as I was reading Perfidia, especially in the character of Dudley Smith, who's a major character in this book, you can't help but remember James Cromwell's fantastic performance in that movie. And overall, that movie itself is just fantastic. It's just a great example of not only of how a movie is a collaborative effort, how everything comes together and you have this perfect thing, this lightning in a bottle. I mean, it's also a great example of perfect adaptation from the book. I don't know if you ever read any of James Ellroy's books, or L.A. Confidential, the novel. I had many years ago, and it's a thick book. It's a doorstop of a novel. He had this great ensemble cast. Guy Pearce, I think, in his first American role, because prior to that it was Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which I had not seen when it first came out. And then you had Russell Crowe, who had been in a couple of American movies. And then you had Kevin Spacey, right after he had gotten the Academy. He had been in Seven, and he had been in The Usual Suspects, and it was just a great ensemble piece. And what about it? I like, so you have all this great group of actors working off each other, and Kim Basinger as well. It's also a great movie about Los Angeles. I'm a Los Angeles resident. I've been here all my life. And it's difficult to nail the exact vibe, of the city, and also to shoot it the right way, because it's a very, spread out, sprawled out city. And L.A. Confidential is one of those movies that nails, a certain vibe of a certain time, in the city. It is the early 50s, but it's not squeaky clean. The movie, sends that up in the beginning with Danny DeVito's voiceover, and he's fantastic as Sid Hudgens. As well, and there's just a certain vibe that everyone has an idea as to what it is, but this movie, doesn't make, it's not sends it up, but certainly, paints a much different picture of it, and also it's surprising it's such a fantastic movie from a guy, Curtis Hanson, who, the next movie he did was Wonder Boys, and then he did 8 Mile, and he hasn't really done anything since. Again, which really lends itself to that lightning in a bottle. But also just the story of itself involving, the entertainment industry and freeways and the cops and the issues of racism and just how it all comes together. It really encapsulates the city so well. And, as I mentioned earlier, it's also just a fantastic, use of adaptation from novel to movie. And then even the little touches. I remember, Curtis Hanson talking about he wanted to shoot a period piece, but even though this is the 50s, he didn't want anyone wearing fedoras, and he didn't want anyone smoking. There's a little bit of that from James Cromwell and a couple of other people, but you notice the movie's so good, You don't even realize it. No one's wearing fedoras, and no one's really smoking. And the performances are so good. Even there's stuff that, I was rewatching it last night where it's telegraphed in the beginning. Where James Cromwell asks Guy Pearce, are you willing, he asks those things, is he willing to become a detective? And he does all that in the movie. And you don't think about it because again, the performances are so good. It reminds me of that even with almost on the level of a Goodfellas. And the fact, it's so well done. Even if you had seen it many times before, you're always going to enjoy, what you've got, what it is. And I value it also just because of the historical aspect as well. It's also born out of Chinatown and things like that. But Chinatown is monumental. Again, because you have that ensemble where you have all these actors playing off each other. And the fact is that there are three leads in L.A. Confidential. And I really like how they all come together. It's because they happen to be working in the Hollywood police station that one night, and that's how the whole thing starts off.
To me, it really represents two things that I'm so fascinated by in your country, which is the 50s specifically. I think it's the most fascinating decade. To touch upon what you said, that this is America following the Great Depression and two world wars. We're coming out of a sort of a second dark ages, and we're dealing with an America which has emerged from the ashes, so to speak, and is presenting an image of itself that now America is squeaky clean because they're selling an image, as Danny DeVito says. And in actual fact, we have this one little hotspot right here in Los Angeles, the pinnacle of success, where you can go to make it big. You can go to be a star. You might get discovered, but what you might also do is end up in a world of prostitution, of drugs, even back then, of all kinds of unbelievably seedy activity, which seems so much more seedy. I'm the kind of guy who, before I saw this movie, didn't think swear words had existed back in that time.
Well, that is the image. It's certainly, if you read James Ellroy, he is very much, waiting. That is his thing of going through the, because this type of muck, racism, the fact of the sleaziness had always been around. Well, there was just such an image of the 50s. We're not used to the idea that, this had always been around. That's what makes even Perfidia even more fascinating, is the fact that it's 1941, and this is World War II. Again, we have this idea in our head that it's still kind of a wholesome time. But again, this behavior doesn't disappear. It's always been around. And I recommend the book just because of the depiction that goes on at that time, and especially for an era that doesn't get a lot of depiction, I think, outside of, unfortunately, the movie 1941. You don't get that view. And also going back to L.A. Confidential, what's also fascinating is that L.A. is not known for being a mob town. And it's never really, it's not like a New York or a Chicago, there's no untouchables, but there was that history. And it's something that the movie kind of does that all in the beginning, gets that out of the way, which, I don't know, for any long-time listeners, I think I may have, many years ago reviewed the movie Gangster Squad, and I had mentioned that,
L.A. Confidential for idiots.
Yeah, well, not only that, but the fact we know exactly what happens in L.A. Confidential, so everything that happened in Gangster Squad was completely moot, and it just made it even more ridiculous. But it's certainly the image being sold, but again, you have this kind of human behavior that doesn't disappear, and it's seeing it through that era isn't fascinating because it's not depicted. It wasn't really depicted at that time, even though it did exist. Sid Hudgens, working for Hush Hush magazine, those types of magazines existed with that kind of the drugs and the sex going on, and the gossip and the scandal, and also the idea of the new LAPD. Again, the history for someone like myself who living in this town, it has very good relevance, and I think. But not only do you have all that history, but again, it's the cast that really sells it, and because these were all They weren't character actors, but they weren't. No one. There was no one was being. They were playing their characters in a sense, and it was so excellent. And even I think it was Edgar Wright had pointed this out that in a lot of these police movies, it's usually the superior, the captain that's evil, and that's exactly what happens. But James Cromwell is so good. You forget that. You just enjoy. You're enjoying the history, you're enjoying the acting, you're enjoying, everything that goes on, the settings. Again, you don't give much thought about, the fact that it is still hitting certain beats. When I was watching it last night, I was paying attention to the idea that, Russell Crowe's character is portrayed as this kind of thug, dim-bulb kind of cop. He's actually, he knows what he's doing. He just doesn't give off that original impression. There's definitely a journey for all those three characters, and it's not any grand realization. It was something that to me was there, and this everything that goes on in the movie brought it to life. And I know the book really goes into much more detail about that, but again, the book is huge and just goes into all kinds of different directions. I think the greatest thing that got cut out from the book was that in the book, L.A. Confidential, there's this whole subplot about this Walt Disney surrogate, and his son is I think a deranged serial killer, and it gets covered up. It gets in some crazy places.
Well, I mean, the other thing that I'm particularly fascinated about in this movie, and it's kind of weird, but I actually cut all the characters in this movie a bit of slack because I always remember that this is the 50s. You have to remember that most, if not all of these characters, they've been in a war. They've been in a world war. We're dealing with people who are now who they are because of that, probably more than any built-in born with character flaw. I mean, these men came home changed from that war, and now they're cops. And you think about that, and I would like to think that either they returned home with a stronger resolve to do good and keep defending their country, and they were idealists in that way, or they came home broken, and being a cop is a good way, let's be honest, to hide behind a badge and work out your frustrations, to put it mildly. And you look at guys not just like Dudley Smith, but also his collaborators, we find out, the detectives Stensland and Meeks, who, I mean, why are they the way they are? Why is Exley the way he is, this pencil-pushing prick, but also someone with a certain core of righteousness behind him? Why is Bud the way he is? I just think about all these questions. Now, the movie doesn't necessarily lay out the answers for you because, I like to think of that joke that, are you comfortable ratting out dirty cops? We're all dirty cops!
Right,
because they are.
Right, it's interesting you mentioned about them coming up from a war, and I was thinking about that when I was watching the movie. There's no reference of these guys being veterans at all, so we don't know really. I mean, we get the one that gives the most personal story is Bud White, and the fact of why he pursues, women beaters and because of that terrible, story he gives, and that's pretty much the essence of his character.
Well, believe it or not, I mean, the reason why I thought about that, it wasn't something that I initially thought of when I first saw the movie. It was something that I revisited after I'd played L.A. Noir, the video game, which has so much of L.A. Confidential in it. Yes. It is even true. But in that game, you're playing a self-righteous cop who really has come back from the war. In fact, the opening sequence is in the war, and he's come back with a very strong resolve to do right. And yet all the guys he's after are these thugs and rapists and serial killers, and all of them, it seems to be implied, have come back from the war themselves, damaged people, and some of them even use it as an excuse for what they do. So I just took that and I thought about that in the context of this movie too.
Well, that's great that you mentioned L.A. Noir. I mean, because that game was set in 1947 and set in 1953. So a little bit of time has passed, and this is the early 50s. So again, when people think of the 50s, they think of Happy Days, or they think of convertibles, and they think of teenage, just James Dean. That's like mid to late. The early 50s is a very interesting time, and I have to like a movie like The Master really goes into great detail about, again, this is after World War II. There's also the Korean War, which ends up in a stalemate. It's a very, time where there's a lot of shifting. It's the start of the Cold War. There's a lot of paranoia going on, and L.A. Confidential doesn't touch on that, but it does go into one piece of that era that doesn't get depicted as much, as you would think. But yeah, I think L.A. Confidential, and certainly in time, has been very kind to it as well. Of course, it's one of the movies that people think it got, robbed at the Oscars because of Titanic, and
I keep forgetting that it didn't win.
It only won for Kim Basinger. She won for Best Supporting Actress. And her performance, a lot of people thought, she isn't in the movie that much, and it's, she's just not given a lot to do. I think she's very good. I mean, after a lot of thought, she's not a weak link in the movie. She has a very limited role. She comes off, she's a capable woman, very understanding of her situation. Just that's who she is. So it just seemed, of all the the roles that got awarded, she got the award.
She is vital to it, though. She is what brings Exley and Bud together, albeit in a really, really wrong way.
Well, what's interesting about that scene, and when I was rewatching it with Exley, was that I didn't, it's not something I caught on the first time, but and rewatching it last night, I realized that she had been contacted to seduce Exley. She wasn't. It wasn't like there was some natural, there wasn't any love there. She had been, because that's why she was looking at the door, because Sid Hudgens was standing there in the shadows with the camera. Because how else they got those photos and how they were positioned in such a way? Mm. I mean, it was a blackmail. It's not something I had picked up on, after all this time after seeing it. But it has certainly a lot of influence over other properties to this day. I think of it like in that way, in the same level as Heat is, in terms of the cop genre. And again, I want to just lastly reference the fact how much this was lightning in a bottle, because another work of James Ellroy's, The Black Dahlia, which was an earlier book, which is about a very famous murder in 1947 Los Angeles, which also gets patterned after in L.A. Noir, it was directed by Brian De Palma. Was no good. It was just terrible. And I think it also read that it got, there's a different cut and all that, but it just never came together. And unfortunately, it had very interesting subject matter that just wasn't handled a certain way, which really, again, lends itself to what was really put together with L.A. Confidential. And I'll finally mention also, I think this movie also has really good pacing and timing as well. I like to think of the three-person interrogation scene where Exley's managing all those three suspects and manipulating them in such a way. I thought that was fantastic.
It's so ironic because that's the point in the movie when I actually start to like him. And yeah, I'm feeling so conflicted about it because Exley is a prick. I mean, he really is. He's a very deeply, deeply flawed person. There's no reason to really like the guy. In fact, it's so weird because the film gives you these two protagonists in Bud and in Exley who could not be more different, but who are both in their own ways as unlikable as the other. And I really feel like the film says to the audience in the first act, pick one. Who are you going to side with? Pick one of these guys. Because chances are, if this film plays predictably, one of them's going to kill the other by the end of this, or they're going to team up one or the other. Well, me, playing it safe, first time I saw it, I said, actually, I'm not going to pick either of those guys. I'm going to side with Jack, played by Kevin Spacey. Jack's my guy. He seems like the most level-headed, bit full of himself, but funny, friendly. I'm sticking with him. So the film kills Jack. It's like it knew. It's like it knew, so it kills my favourite character. But luckily, I don't have to pick one of the other guys after that, because they do team up, and it's something that could have been played so horribly, but I feel like it's a very credible and natural progression, their relationship. Especially since for the first half of the film, it would seem inconceivable that they could team up.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think the movie does a great job in working these characters together, so it's not as if they're just shoehorned, in just one scene. You two are now working together. Well, that, there's no connection for that. So they really, because how it all comes together is that they first come together in the police station, in the first few opening scenes, and then they're working different sides of this huge conspiracy. So to me, it's a natural progression to how they end up working together. Although interestingly enough, I don't think Bud and Jack ever worked together. I don't think they're even in the same scene.
No, there's literally one shot where Jack says, "Hey, Bud, you better get down there before your partner kills somebody." And,
right.
And Bud says nothing back. And actually, I remember Russell Crowe saying, "My only regret in that film is I never get to say anything back to Kevin Spacey." It's the only shot they're ever in together.
That's right. That's right. And it's only Exley becomes the hub from. Well, that's maybe not correct, but yeah, it becomes Vincennes and Exley, but Exley and White, but you never have Vincennes and White working together. And you have these to me, you have these really, these three-dimensional characters in a sense that are first portrayed, one way, and then again gradually brought into having a fuller picture of who they are. And again, we have that progression. There isn't some crazy quirk with any of these characters. There's no, one defining trait, and that's who they are. They're always going to be like that. Again, I really lend this movie a lot of credit for doing what they do in the running time they have, because if you had the book like this now, I mean, it wouldn't be done as a movie. It'd be a miniseries or a TV show, and then all the stuff that would be in the book would be put out there. That's my feeling on this prequel, that you wouldn't have. It'd be just done as an HBO TV miniseries or a series.
Which is funny you say, because on the Blu-ray for the film, it does have a TV pilot starring Kiefer Sutherland for L.A Confidential, which I haven't seen yet.
Either have I. I've been told that it is not good. But
well, of course, it's just a pilot.
It's a big steep step down from Kevin Spacey to Kiefer Sutherland.
That's right, he's playing Jack. It's weird. It really is weird. But, I mean, personally, not only would I subscribe to what Ed's saying, but I'd also subscribe to the theory that not just is it perfect casting, but it's actors having a great time. And that counts for something in film. If the actors are having a great time, we're going to have a great time. If they're cashing in or they're embarrassed to be there, your film's doomed no matter what. And personally, I wouldn't compare L.A Confidential to something like Heat, simply because I don't think actors generally have a good time on Michael Mann films. It's kind of an intense environment, but L.A Confidential is more like Glenn Ross or 12 Angry Men, where you just have, it's a character play essentially. Even though there's a lot of action and there's a real pulse and a pace to it, you can tell with the intensity and the anger these actors are having to portray, they're still having a blast. They're saying to themselves, "Oh man, we've all got great parts. I'm not jealous of anyone. Let's do this."
But I think I also, and I want to also mention how great Jerry Goldsmith's score is in this movie, which has a very noir feel, and how it kind of comes in and then drops out, comes in and then drops out. Very good score, by the way. Very nice, not overpowering. Doesn't get crazy with the saxophone, or the trumpet rather, and it does. It's really good, and it fits the movie very well. I'll say about its not getting its due at the Oscars. I mean, I think it's just that I remember some commenter online talking about at the time people value L.A. Confidential as a classic or as an excellent movie now because it's just been looked at as time goes on, in a different light. And in the Academy, the Oscars, we've all gone down that road before. They may reward something that just fits the what's going on at that time, or the fact is it was Titanic and it was so massive, it just the momentum was for that. But it's L.A. Confidential has its place, and the other thing. Oh, and now I remember also it did get an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it did get that. It's also one of the few movies I can think of where the author of the source material said that they did a fantastic job on the adaptation. Elroy on the commentary, I think, said they did it exactly right.
Well, I mean, I'd just like to say as a final note, not just as well as thanking Ed for bringing up the movie and giving me an excuse to watch it again, but yeah, I mean, if you haven't seen it before, maybe even if I'm speaking to the kids out there, don't mean to sound condescending, but I really do mean this, folks, that, you know, you'll see the film on a shelf somewhere and it'll have some kind of Oscar sticker slapped on it, some kind of nomination thing. You'll have this awards buzz mentality. You'll think it's some arty-farty Oscar crowd-pleasing piece of work that would not appeal to people who just like really well-crafted, slick movies. But this movie, it has a pulse and a pace and a heart and balls and sexiness and amazing characters, and it has... Most movies fail to do any of those. Most movies struggle to do one of those things right. L.A. Confidential's got it all. And I really, really feel like any kid, like, I'm not even joking, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old could watch this movie. They could immediately get wrapped in the characters, in the action, in the pace, in the story, in the criminal conspiracy, and they'll say, not only do I love that film, I want to see more films. I want to see more R-rated dramas just like that with those actors. So I really feel like this is the kind of movie that's an in for cinema, deserves to be talked about. So thank you for choosing it.
Oh, well hey, I just appreciate being on and being able to talk about this movie.
Next week, folks, let's talk about... you said Brian De Palma. I think we'll do Bonfire of the Vanities next week. How does that sound?
Oh, Lord.